Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out on this lovely Chicago January evening. We really appreciate you being here. I'm Kathy Kaloji, currently serving as the president of the Village Chicago's board. And we are thrilled tonight for many reasons. First, we're thrilled that Marc Freedman has chosen this event as his Chicago book tour stop, particularly because the message of his book fits in perfectly with what is happening right now in the Village. We're also thrilled because this event kicks off, it's one in our longevity series, but it kicks off our 10th anniversary year, and our theme this year is intergenerational connection. And while the Village has always connected people of different ages, we're being very intentional about it this year and embarking on some new initiatives, so this is just perfect. Another exciting thing that's happening right now is we have a new Bridging Generations board. This is a talented group of young people who are working to create meaningful connections between the generations. And if any of you are here tonight, if you would stand up. Thank you for, some of you are back there. Thank you for being here and for taking on that initiative. We're excited about what will come of it. Thank you always to all of our sponsors that support the Village all year long, especially tonight to DePaul University for this fabulous venue. And DePaul has been a staunch supporter of the Village since it was an idea, before it even existed, and we are very grateful for that support. Also, thank you to Artists, Senior Living, and Encore for helping us with the reception afterwards. Now I'd like to introduce Avery Stone-Fish of Chicago Innovation to talk to you about one of our intergenerational initiatives. Avery?
Okay, I'm going to use this microphone. Thank you, Kathy. We are so excited at Chicago Innovation to be partnering with the Village Chicago in a brand new initiative. It's called Ageless Innovators. It's an intergenerational co-mentoring program. It's the first mentoring program that works to connect highly successful individuals and innovators across generations and across businesses. And that's why we're really excited about this first wave of mentors and co-mentors that we'll be including in 2019. One more person who I'm really excited, who is not on this screen up here, but is going to be involved in the reciprocal mentoring program in the second cohort of 2019, and that's Eva Maddox. Eva has been an interior designer and an amazing designer for many years. She's won over 200 design awards and was actually named Chicagoan of the Year by Chicago Magazine. Please welcome Eva Maddox.
Wow. Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to see you here tonight and to welcome our noted speaker, Marc Freedman. He is the #1 authority and leading expert on longevity revolution in the world, so we should be really honored. Marc is an author and the social entrepreneur, which I think he was named just recently #1 by the World Economic Forum. He has filled his career with working with children and adults and people like us, a little bit over 50, who are really looking for other ways to be helpful and to have a wonderful life. Marc has worked to engage older people, untapped talents, and to help cultivate those young people, unmet talents with that. I met Marc in 2007 and again in 2008 with the Purpose Prize. His book is going to offer us really a hopeful message, and I hope that everyone goes away with that. We have such divisive times now that this will encourage us really to look beyond ourselves and think about how to collaborate more independently. Marc will certainly show us the way. So it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Marc Freedman. Please join us on the stage.
Well, we're delighted to welcome you. The notion of bringing generations together for mutual benefit is a powerful, big idea, and it's one the village is 100% behind. So I'm going to start and say, why this book? Why now?
You know, every once in a while, I think, oh, the idea of bringing generations together, that's so obvious. Why does anybody need to run around and say that there are natural connections between older and younger people? And then I'll turn on the news or I'll turn on the TV. How many of you saw Saturday Night Live this past weekend? The game Millennial Millionaire, where it set up Rachel Brosnahan from The Marvelous Miss Maisel is playing a millennial, and then one of the SNL cast members as well. And the challenge is they can win a massive amount of money if they can stay silent while a boomer comes out and talks for 30 seconds. I'll skip to the end and say nobody wins any of the money. And it's all, you know, the categories are Social Security, generational debt. So we have, and I don't know if any of you saw, this was certainly not on Saturday Night Live, but during the midterm election, there was an ad being run by a group called Knock the Vote, which had a series of older people telling young people not to vote. And there were lines like, "Climate change, that's a you problem, I'll be dead then." And it was sort of reminiscent of the great Groucho Marx line about, everybody always talks about posterity, what's posterity ever done for me? So I feel like there is this constant message in our society that the generations are naturally at odds, kids versus canes, that this gray wave of greedy geezers is going to take America to the cleaners. And I don't want to be a Pollyanna. There are serious issues, but right now, for the first time ever, as of January 1, we have more people over 60 in this country than under 18. We have officially crossed the Rubicon of becoming a more old than young society. And we need to find ways to bring older and younger people together to make the most of this multi-generational world. And so that's a very long-winded account of why I'm interested in this issue.
Terrific, thanks. One of the things that you write in the book is the first person to live to 150 is alive today. Now, I'm hoping that it's one of these people in this audience, actually. I think that would be pretty cool. And I happen to agree with that, personally, I really do. But what are the implications of this regarding how we need to compose a life for ourselves? Because I'm a strong believer that we don't tend to do that. And we tend to think that, quote unquote, this retirement age is where some things end, as opposed to really seeing that as a point when things begin.
It's interesting because that line comes from a Prudential billboard, and I hope there are no Prudential employees here, because when I came into Chicago last night, I got into downtown, and there was another Prudential billboard which says, your job won't be replaced by a robot if you're able to retire first. So the fear-mongering approach to billboards, and it turns out we have terrible traffic where I live, and for an entire year I got planted in front of that Prudential billboard about the first person to live to 150 has already been born. And I went to their website, and basically they were arguing that retirement age would stay at 65, and then people would have to figure out how to pay for themselves for 85 years. I spent my whole life in the nonprofit sector, so that is daunting. But it reminds me of when John F. Kennedy got up in 1963 in front of Congress and gave his most important speech on aging. He said we'd added years to life, Now it was time to add life to those years. Since that day, we've added 2 months a year on average to the American lifespan. And I think we've been really struggling with what to do, especially because those years haven't been tacked on at the end. They're not frail years. They're years that are really coming in the middle. And yet, this period that's emerged has been described as a season in search of a purpose. And I think that's a problem for us as individuals in terms of what that purpose is, but also as a society, when you have such an increase in people who are in that part of life, it's incumbent on us to figure out how to make the most of that period. And I really believe that purpose, one of the main purposes, is something that we already know that runs deeply within us, and it's the purpose of leaving the world better than we found it, of investing in future generations, and I think that's something that we've lost.
How, though, can we personally compose a life for ourselves, then, that embraces all of that?
Well, I think part is to recognize the time frame and to get that right, that we do have this second bite at the apple, and it may not be as long as the middle years, but it can be as significant. And there are so many people out there already who are making a monument out of what has been declared the leftover years. We heard from Eva Maddox. We at Encore launched a prize 12 years ago, the Purpose Prize that Eva mentioned, for social innovators over the age of 60. And the idea, is also, as Eva was suggesting, we just thought of it as the opposite of a Lifetime Achievement Award. It was an investment in what somebody 60 years old is going to do next. And we launched it with great fanfare, and then got very nervous that maybe we were being too optimistic. And in fact, we had a couple of days before the first prizes were about to be launched, we only had a little over 100 nominations, and we were going to give out 5 prizes, so we got worried. And then the floodgates opened. We had 1,200 nominees the first year. We had so many we had to create a fellows program to honor the first 5%, and there were 3 MacArthur Genius Award winners who didn't make it into the fellows program. Sorry, I know I'm in Chicago, but at the end of the decade, there are 10,000 nominees. And working in every domain of society, using their accumulated experience in ways that were solving significant problems, and showing really that innovation and experience could go hand in hand.
That's great. Thanks.
And congratulations to Eva. Is this on? And congratulations to Eva for winning one of those prizes. We're so proud of you, our village member. Yeah. So one of the things you say in the book is have younger friends with a vengeance. So what do those friendships look like? And what are some of the misconceptions that generations have about each other?
Well, the Purpose Prize, I think, was an example of one of those misconceptions, which is that creativity is the exclusive province of the young, and you hit a magical age. But I think one of the, this may be taking a very roundabout route to answering that good question, but I think that despite so much rhetoric about disconnection between the generations, like the Saturday Night Live skit demonstrates, that in fact we are in a renaissance of warm feeling between older and younger people. The Pew Research Centers has every year does surveys of how different generations feel about each other, and they've never seen such close ties between boomers and millennials, the 2 groups that were focused in that group. And in fact, multi-generational living is now at the highest level that since 1940, and people are quick to say, oh, well, that must be just because of the downturn, but in fact, since the downturn, as the economy's rebounded, the numbers have gone up. So I think there's a real natural resilience, and it's really important because as I spent a lot of time in the book, and this was really a surprise about the book. I thought I was writing a book about death, and instead of Silicon Valley's obsession with cheating death, how we needed to kind of come to terms with our own mortality and recognize that the route to happiness is investing in younger generations, and that ended up being a big theme of the book. And to answer your question more directly, I mean, one of the reasons we need to connect with younger people is because it will make us happy. The most significant longitudinal study of happiness in adulthood that's been done, the Harvard study of adult development, which actually began with JFK's class at Harvard and included adults of a wide variety of socioeconomic backgrounds, came to two principal conclusions. The first is that love matters most. Happiness is love, full stop, is what one of the directors of the study said. But that love has a particular direction as well. Love that flows down the generational chain. Older people who mentor younger people are 3 times as likely to be happy as those who fail to do so. And George Valent, the Harvard psychiatrist who ran the study for 40 years and who's kind of a poet, has a beautiful expression. He says, biology flows downhill. That is the way we were set up. That's why it makes us happy. It's not just a moment in time. And so I think one of the reasons we want to correct this misconception that old and young are at each other's throats and that there's no real common feeling is because, in fact, older and younger people were built for each other. And as a society, we've made it more difficult to connect, but it's an essential route to happiness.
Terrific. Yeah, we both love that being able to be 3 times likely to be happier if that's done is I think is great. So I'm lucky enough to be on one of the trustees of the Retirement Research Foundation, and in fact, the president and vice president of the Retirement Research Foundation are both here tonight. And recently there was a study that the Retirement Research Foundation helped fund that looked at reframing aging and the importance of even changing vernacular to talk about older people and younger people, as opposed to elders and seniors and lots of, just even in that most simple a way, to be able to start people, to start changing the frame of reference on what being an older person means. What's your perspective on that relative to what you wrote about?
I read the study, and I've been really influenced by it. And I should also say, you mentioned that 2 people from Retirement Research Foundation are here tonight. I would not be here tonight if it wasn't for the Retirement Research Foundation. 25 years ago, Marilyn Hennessy at Retirement Research made a small grant to the organization I was working with at that time that got me started down this path. So I have endless gratitude. In fact, I think I should wash their cars or something like that.
Definitely.
I owe some kind of, but this kind of goes to I talked before about kind of how the book started out in one direction and went in another, and the direction that this is mostly a book about age segregation in American society and how we went at the beginning of the 20th century from being one of the most age-integrated societies in the world to something that could be described as age apartheid, despite these recent trends I just talked about that are reversing that. And it's really a remarkable story. I don't know if many of you realize that in the 19th century in this country, there was no conception of age, no consciousness of age whatsoever. Birthdays weren't celebrated. Knowing somebody's age would be akin to knowing the blood type of the person sitting next to you. Nobody would ever even think to ask. The birthday song, by the way, was invented in 1934. The greeting card companies had a lot to do with that. And we lived in a society which was thoroughly integrated by age. We lived in multi-generational households, worked on farms, went to one-room schoolhouses where people were often in their 30s and 40s, and then in a remarkably short period of time, we reshuffled the deck so that young people were in educational settings, middle people were in work settings, and older people were in places like retirement communities and nursing homes and senior centers. And that created a huge problem for older people by the middle of the century. Walter Reuther, the great UAW leader, described retirees as too old to work, too young to die in 1948 when he got up in front of his union in Milwaukee. And there was a cultural void, and there was this, just sense of being out of step with society. And then a group of entrepreneurs came in, foremost among them Del Webb, who invented Sun City, coined the phrase the golden years, and culturally came up with this idea at a time when American society was obsessed with youth, with teenagers in the 1950s, of later life as a second childhood. That was the essence of the golden years idea, graying as playing. And then a whole set of institutions were formulated, places like Sun City and Leisure World, that were examples of radical age segregation. And those two things, what Betty Friedan called the youth short circuit and radical age segregation, actually went hand in hand, because to preserve the illusion of a second youth, that you could be a kid again, it was very helpful not to have any actual children in the picture. And so, if everybody was old, nobody was old. And for 50 years, those two, this cultural conception of later life as a second childhood of the golden years, and a whole of this age segregation have gone hand in hand. And so that's why I think the report that you talked about is so important, because we need a cultural revolution. Rather than trying so hard to be young, we need to be there for those who actually are. And we need a revolution in the institutions of daily life. We need to rethink education, housing, communities, work, in ways where the generations can come together and make what's natural normal.
And so what can we do individually to help reframe aging culturally?
I mean, this is. I would say the biggest thing we can do is to be proximate, think about how we're living our lives. Are we living in an age bubble? At Encore, we have this quiz: are you living in an age bubble? The neighborhood you move into, the decision to be part of a village that has a focus on intergenerational connection, those things are enormously important. Where even the settings where you volunteer. In the book, this may be a little bit of a detour from what you're saying, but I told the story in the book of a film that I saw at the Music Box Theater here, and I had been chasing it around the country, and I was here for the Chicago Ideas Festival, and it was playing at the Music Box, and it's a film that none of you probably have ever heard of. It's called Keep On Keepin' On. It's a documentary about Clark Terry, the great jazz trumpet player who was Miles Davis's mentor. He was Quincy Jones's mentor, who, as he moved into his 70s, went to teach at a music school in northern New Jersey, and he had diabetes, was losing his eyesight, and he was connected with a young blind pianist named Justin Coughlin, and it was a co-mentoring example, because it was mostly seen Justin was going to help Clark Terry learn how to live without his eyesight. But it turned into one of the most beautiful relationships I've ever seen depicted between an older person and a younger one. But it all happened because Clark Terry made the decision to put himself in an environment where there were young people. And in the end, it was what kept Clark Terry alive. There's a wonderful quote from Quincy Jones in the film about that this relationship became his reason to get up in the morning. But it also, it shaped Justin Coughlin in very powerful ways, and one of the most powerful, and this relates to your question of what we can do as individuals, is that he tried to teach Justin to sound like himself, not to sound like Clark Terry, but to sound like Justin Coughlin. And I think that's one of the sort of living on through letting go was a big theme in that film. So I think be proximate. Seek out opportunities to be with younger but but don't try to give a lot of advice, and just be there for the relationship. And I think that's very important as well.
I think that's great. I think that's also, Diane and I are both such strong advocates of supporting this ageless. Having started it, I guess you better be supportive of it, right? That we are both so strong supporters and believers in ageless innovators, because that's exactly is being in the present with older and younger people, building that relationship. Yeah.
I can't wait to see what happens as a result of it. So you are such a great storyteller. You've traveled around the country looking at promising ideas, things that are bubbling up, that are helping to sort of bust age segregation and bridging the generations together. So what are some things that stand out that you've seen that are most innovative that maybe altogether we could bring to Chicago, especially in the area of housing?
Well, I'll go back to that idea of proximity, because I think a lot of what we need to do now is really very simple. It's not coming up with, extraordinarily, unheard of ideas. And I'll start with a pop culture reference. I don't know if anybody here has seen the Kaminsky Method. Great show, just won the Golden Globe. But there's a heartbreaking moment in it where Michael Douglas, it's about the relationship between Michael Douglas, who plays this Lee Strasberg-like acting coach, and his agent, played by Alan Arkin. And Michael Douglas is having a really difficult time. He's got a big debt, and he's trying to kind of get centered. And so he takes a walk through the park and comes upon a playground where these young children are playing, and there's this joyous voices, and it just takes him out of his own suffering, and he sits down at the bench and he's just enjoying these children, and then you see in the background their mothers are starting to talk to each other. They call the police because what's this old guy doing looking at these children? And I thought, I think all this age segregation, it's a grievous wound that we've inflicted on ourselves. So that, and I thought it was captured so beautifully in that scene. And it made me think of a scene that I encountered outside of Portland, Maine 2 years ago, and I wrote about it in the book, but it's about an assisted living community there called Gorham House. Was created by an entrepreneur who built 3 retirement communities, and in each of them, he put a preschool right front and center and a playground in the front. And when you drive up to Gorham House, you don't hear the whir of golf carts. You don't hear that kind of depressing silence that you often encounter in those kinds of settings. What you hear are peals of laughter, and what you see are all these older people sitting around the playground without police being summoned. And it turns out that not only do older people volunteer in the preschool, and the preschool students visit older people living there, but the most coveted places are the ones that overlook the playground. And I think that we need to be designing our housing, our assisted living facility in ways that bring the generations together. My favorite example, and I'll end with this, I love telling the story, but in Cleveland, in Judson Manor, which is this beautiful former 1920s hotel that's now a CCRC, between the Cleveland Clinic and Case Western and the Institute of Music and the Institute of Art, Judson Manor decided to allocate 7 units in the facility for graduate music students. And they did it because everybody there loves music. They thought it would increase the cultural quotient of the place. But all kinds of things started happening that weren't anticipated. And when I went there, I met this young violist who had gotten engaged to another young violist while she was living there. And when they decided to get married, they had asked their 93-year-old neighbor to be the maid of honor. And that's what happens when you bring people together, who have common interests. This fundamental humanity ends up emerging. And so I think we need to do things like that. And it's not that complicated.
So I have 3 boys, and you have 3 boys. The ages are different. Mine are 34, 32, and 28, and yours are 13, 10, and 8.
9, 11, and 13.
9, 11, and 13.
Yeah.
So mine are certainly I can't teach mine anything anymore. That's for sure. What do you want to teach yours still about aging?
This is a good example of how I could sit them down and read dramatic passages from How to Live Forever. I have a feeling that won't work out so well. But it turns out we live in a neighborhood. My mother is in Philadelphia. We live in Berkeley, in California. My wife's parents are in Southern California. And we have these neighbors 2 doors down, Joyce and Jake Anderson, who are in their 80s, and their own grandchildren are in far-flung places. And so when our grandparents aren't visiting and their grandparents aren't visiting, which is about 98% of the time, they've become surrogate grandparents for our kids, and they're teaching our kids about the role older people can play in communities, and I hope they'll remember it someday when they get to be in their 80s as well, which, as we know from the Prudential ad, is midlife. But I think that this is one of the most powerful arguments for proximity, because Erik Erikson, great scholar of human development, he said the hallmark of successful development in this period of later life could be encapsulated in the phrase, "I am what survives of me." And he called it generativity. And at the end of his life, Daniel Goleman, then writing for the New York Times, interviewed Erikson about what his observations were on his life. And he said that he felt like we had lost a sense of the wholeness of life because we've divided people up so much by age. And as a society, we had lost the sense of generativity, that we weren't thinking about the well-being of future generations. And I think we have been really in danger of losing that. And I think that's one of the reasons why we need to reestablish the cycle of life. And produce a sense of, help educate young people about how to be good elders.
Thanks.
And the book is really just the start. You've got this Gen to Gen campaign, and as part of the Village's 10th anniversary year, we are absolutely with you. We'll be joining the campaign, and this is to mobilize 1 million people to stand up and with young people. So tell us where it is today and where you hope it's going to go.
Yes, as you were saying, this is, sometimes I think about the million, it's a little bit like the Mike Myers character in Austin Powers, where he, demands the ransom of $1 million. We kind of picked the 1 million number out of a hat, but we wanted to show in the context of, so much, worrisome coverage of how future generations were not, older people were not thinking about future generations, that there is a movement already out there of older people who are living in these generative ways, and to create a community among people, and to really shine a spotlight on different ways that people are doing it. So we've been giving out, Eva mentioned, a prize for creative ideas for connecting the generations, and it's brought to light so many, like a group in New York at LaGuardia Community College, Pushy Moms, where a group of older women who had put their own kids through four-year institutions are helping immigrant young people who are at LaGuardia Community College transition from 2-year to 4-year institutions and navigate that bureaucracy, or Grandmas to Go in Southern Oregon, which is a group of grandmothers who are out supporting single-parent families raising kids. Or one of my favorites that came out this year is Nuns and Nuns. Nuns being, when millennials fill out these religious affiliation surveys, they check nun. And so it's a bunch of millennials who've sought out nuns who have spent their whole life working for the greater good and who are in co-mentoring relationships. And I think, and that's what I've been discovering going around the country with this book, is how many great things are happening, like the intergenerational work here at the Village. One of my favorite, I'll tell 2 quick stories. There's a great project going on in the UK now called Now Teach that was created by Lucy Kellaway, beloved columnist at the Financial Times, whose daughter was in the British equivalent of Teach for America, called Teach First. And she was so inspired and a little guilty about what her daughter was doing. She wrote a column at age 58, a year and a half ago, saying that she was going to quit her job and teach maths in a low-income British school. And then she did something that nobody here, so far as I can tell, has done, but what the Gen to Gen campaign is trying to do. She challenged her readers of a certain age to quit their jobs and join her. 1,000 people came forward for 20 slots, and then they managed to get it up to almost 50 slots. But there's now this movement in the UK of older people who are teaching in much the way that Teach for America is here. And I just think that I hope that through Gen to Gen, nationally in communities, we can challenge each other to stand up and show up for young people.
I'm a strong advocate for the millennials. I work with them, with many of them, and I'll get asked all the time, whether it's at Chicago Innovation or whether I'm teaching at Kellogg or whether I'm out doing this, doing that, how do you deal with them? How do you deal with those millennials? And my response to that is that I deal with those millennials the same exact way as I deal with any human being, with respect, with consideration, and trying to make sure that whatever they're trying to achieve, I can help them achieve that. What's your view on how we, as older people, can and should interact with millennials?
Well, since most of us boomers still think we're the age of the millennials, it does kind of come as a shock. I turned 60 this year, and I'm still coming to terms with that. But, you know, one of my favorite films, I'm sure everybody here saw The Intern with Robert De Niro and Anne Hathaway in this wonderful co-mentoring relationship. And I feel like there's a great template in that film. And in fact, there's a great new book out called Wisdom at Work, The Making of a Modern Elder, by a guy named Chip Conley, who basically invented the boutique hotel idea. He created the Joie de Vivre hotel group and retired from that in his mid-50s and was tapped by the millennial founders of Airbnb to be their mentors. They said, come mentor us. And what he quickly discovered is that he, like the Robert De Niro character, was both a mentor and an intern. And he decided he had become a modern elder. And I think that that's a great way of thinking about this extraordinary mutuality of that our experience does matter, but also there's so much to learn. And it's a beautiful sweet spot in life where you actually have accumulated some lessons from life, and you have enough time to do something with it and enough time to learn so much more. So I think we can all go out and be modern elders.
I love it. I love it. We're going to open it up to questions in the audience here in just 1 minute, but I want to ask you the question, what's one thing, what's one leave behind that you want to make sure we remember tonight that you believe strongly will enhance our own happiness and our own longevity?
I want to go back to that Harvard study and that one line of happiness is love, full stop. I really think that the most important thing we can do is connect. You know, E.M. Forster had that wonderful line, only connect. And it turns out that in the research for the book, I was looking at what young people need, what older people need, and there's an enormous body of research on resilient youth and young people who make against the odds. And a psychologist from Cornell who co-founded the Head Start program at the end of his career sort of summarized that research, and he said what every child needs is at least one person who's irrationally crazy about them. And when you look at you pair that up with the happiness is love, full stop. For it's young people need connections, older people need connections, all the more at a time when we're being told that we're in the midst of a loneliness epidemic, and particularly older people and younger people are the two loneliest groups in society. But the needs and assets of younger and older people fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. And so I would say we should all go out and try to be part of that jigsaw puzzle, not just for instrumental reasons, but because the connection in and of itself is one of the richest experiences in life.
I love it. Questions?
My question is, for people my age, what advice might you give to not only make us more aware of these generational gaps, but also challenge us to, strive to bring them together?
Well, one is a lesson that I've learned myself, which is that, unlike so many other supposed divides in society, that this division between old and young is unnatural. That, in fact, young people will soon be older people, and the cycle goes on and on. And so I would say to think at this juncture about connecting with older people, not just for what we can learn, but also to learn how we're going to inhabit that stage of life ourselves, because we're going to get to it quicker than we ever imagined. That's certainly been my experience. But I would say, for me, personally, I've had this whole string of older people who have been mentors, and it's just enriched my life enormously. And now I feel like, now that I am their age, when they were mentoring me, I feel like they gave me all these tools to have a good life at this juncture. So just realize that that we're all going to be at that point ourselves, and so we're kind of preparing ourselves for it.
I loved what you had to say about playgrounds and the best spots in dwellings being the areas that are close to the playgrounds where you can hear children. We live close to a playground, and there's a screamer, and she screams every single morning, and my husband can't wait until the screamer comes. He just But my question is more on the architecture point of view, and do you or have you seen or observed in other cities or even other countries where there is intent to create spaces that house both young families and older people, just as sometimes older people are now rooming together? And do you see anything like this? Because I think it's so wise what you're saying.
So the question from an architectural standpoint.
Yes. Well, I have two quick thoughts, one small and one large. One is I'm really excited about how many young people are wading into the issue that you're describing, creating new vehicles for younger and older people to live together, to come into proximity. One of my favorites that kind of dramatizes this whole emergent field is a group called Nesterly, which is started by two recent MIT city planning grads who were aware from their graduate school days in an expensive real estate market in Boston how many young people are really having a hard time finding living arrangements. And at the same time, their research showed them how many older people have had extra space but need help with chores. And so they've created Nesterly to bring supply and demand together. And just like in Judson Manor, supply and demand efficiency leads to humanity. And it's a great program. But more broadly, I spent a bunch of time in Singapore. And Singapore is basically the size of Chicago. They're spending 3 billion Singaporean dollars, only 2.1 billion US dollars to create exactly what you're describing, focused on the built environment. And the vision is a kampong for all ages, kampong being the Malay word for village, built around intergenerational harmony. And they've basically mandated every new senior center or preschool that's built have to be co-located. They've created these 3-gen flats, which is trying to strike the perfect balance between proximity and privacy. So having families or even unrelated people from 3 generations living in buildings where they have their own space, but also opportunities for daily interaction. They've created a policy focused on intensifying the land. I love that. So I visited a church there near the National University of Singapore. Land is precious there, so the leases get renewed every 20 years. And the church was building an assisted living facility, but in order for them to get approval, they had to build a 200-child preschool as well. And then that led them to realize they needed to age integrate their church. So one's a small tech-based innovation, Nesterly, and the other is this kind of grand plan of Singapore. So imagine $2.1 billion in Chicago to age integrate everything. So there's small things and some grand schemes happening as well.
Sounds great. Yes.
Does today's mobility and maybe better economics. So my dad's mother moved in because of economics, and so there we were, right? If she didn't have it, who knows where she would have been? Maybe in a Del Webb.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like that's been the. If I had to define what I've been trying to do for 30 years, it relates to what you're saying. I mean, I think we need to do as much of this as possible in families, but we do live in such a mobile society. How can we create ties, powerful ties among older and younger people who aren't related? And I know from our experience with Experience Corps that you can do that and have extraordinarily significant results. In fact, Experience Corps, there's a bunch of research on it happening through Johns Hopkins Medical School. And they've just come out with 2 studies, one that shows benefits to young people and also shows that that participation in Experience Corps, which is essentially a mentoring and tutoring program with older and younger people now run by the AARP Foundation, it reverses the preconditions of dementia. This is from Hopkins Medical School research. But the prototype for all this is a program that has a Chicago connection and was one of the great triumphs of the war on poverty, the foster grandparent program. Low-income, older, mostly women, working one-on-one with developmentally disabled, young people coming from low-income backgrounds, struggling in one way or another. And it was created by Sergeant Shriver, who I think was a Chicagoan, right? And I got to visit Shriver at the end of his life, and I wanted to ask him about the program, and he told me that it worked, and he said it worked for 2 reasons. One was because it was simple, it was one-on-one, and the second was because it was human, it was all about relationship. And then to prove his point, he went fishing around his desk, and he pulled out this weather-beaten black ashtray, which had all the War on Poverty programs, and Head Start and foster grandparents are right next to each other, along with a slew of public health initiatives. And I love that this, great triumph of public health, this massive government investment was commemorated by an ashtray.
I was kind of curious if you could describe the types of relationships that you see forming through these non-familial mentoring sorts of interactions.
Well, you know, it brings up a point that I really have become convinced is essential, is that thinking of all these major domains of society which have become so age segregated. Diane talked about housing, community institutions like senior centers, preschools, work through the ideas like the modern elder idea. How do we age integrate all of these? And probably the greatest last bastion is higher education. So I thought it was great we're having this at the DePaul Student Center, and I saw examples of what you were describing while I was doing the research in the book. So there now this new set of third stage education programs that were created initially at Harvard, the Advanced Leadership Initiative that Rosabeth Kanter started there for people who finish their midlife careers, who come back to the university for a year to launch their next chapter. Then Stanford copied Harvard, although they'll never admit it, and created a wonderful program that I'm on the board of called the Distinguished Careers Institute. And then it's spread. Notre Dame's starting a new program. The University of Minnesota has something called UMAC, where older people, mostly in their 50s, 60s, 70s, are coming back, spending a year at the university. And I went and saw a course on the future of work there. And I remember encountering this young woman, undergraduate at the beginning, who wanted to know why are there all these old people in her future of work class. And then at the end, she realized, oh, they had actually worked. But none of these programs were designed to age integrate higher education. They were designed to be a new stage of education for the older people. But in the process, they were transforming the education experience. And it's a glimpse of, if we are going to live these, new longevity lives, why load all the education up in the beginning, stuff all the work in the middle, and save all of the leisure for those 85 years at the end? So it's going to require rethinking all of these institutions, just like the one we're sitting in today.
Terrific. We have time for one last question, but before we do, don't forget, Marc is going to stay around here. So during the reception, feel free to ask him other questions.
You may have already answered this, but with Singapore, but do you think what society do you think does the best job of integrating age groups?
Well, one thing that's great at this point is that this is such a global phenomenon. So you've got all these countries like Singapore, Japan, South Korea, in Europe, Italy, Spain, Germany, where something like 40% of the population is going to be over 60 by mid-century, and everybody's dealing with this in a fitful way. So there's a great opportunity to learn. And I think actually I'm really proud of the United States. When Singapore was thinking about what they were going to do, they went to Seattle to see this Providence Mount St. Vincent facility there, where they were doing all this great intergenerational work when Lucy Kellaway's innovation and Now Teach in the UK is based on Teach for America. When I went to Cleveland to see Judson Manor, there were 35 Swedish social scientists who had come to Cleveland in November to get ideas of how to create a better society. When the Scandinavians are coming to the Rust Belt in the middle of the winter, this was no junket, right? So I think there's a tremendous opportunity for international exchange around these ideas. South Korea is doing some remarkable things. The mayor of South Korea has created a major effort to make that city the sort of shining city on the hill for aging well across generations. And so there really is a ripe moment. But nobody's figured this out yet. But we figured out a lot of great things here. I'm going to be sending people to the village.
I know from a lot of my African friends, in Africa, it's the grandparents that raise the kids because the parents have to go off to work. And then, of course, as the kids grow older, then that follows the next generation does it. It's also, when I was growing up, and it's also, I know, in the Native American, so in a lot of people that held on to their background. Now, this isn't one of those, they do it because it's their cultural background. They do it because the older people are seen as a resource. And since this country pretty much runs on money, and this thing came out of the need to make money, I think it's important that we start some sort of campaign that proves that as older people, we are a resource. And frankly, a cheap one, because we run on love. So perhaps what our campaign should be is, you know, just as we did with the, when I worked on the wages for housework. How much would it cost if you were going to buy that, pay that maid and cleaner, et cetera? How much would it cost if you're going to pay for that person who will love your kid and give them an idea of what their possibilities are and take care of them? So.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more. And I would say, you know, when I started doing this work all these many years ago, I was really thinking about almost supply and demand, you know, untapped resources, unmet needs. Older people had this untapped resource. Could we clear this market for caring? And I think what I've learned, and you know, foster grandparents, their motto is every dollar spent twice. So, but I've learned, I believe that as deeply as ever, but what I've learned actually is older people, and I can say we are actually more than just supply and demand. We are actually, older people are built for this role. There is now an accumulation of research. Laura Carstensen at Stanford has this theory called socio-emotional selectivity, which sounds very obscure, but basically what she's shown is that as people reach a point where there are fewer years ahead than behind, that our sense of you know, how much time is left in life gets more compressed, that it drives people to focus on connection and relationship. And she's done studies with people of all ages. And so just think about it. Somebody tells you you've got 4 months left to live. You don't go out and study the oboe. You know, I always wanted to pick up a new instrument, or Mandarin. That seems like a good time. You focus on the people that you love. So we're driven as we get older. And there's now a lot of scientific research on that. Second, we're way better at relationship. Emotional regulation, empathy, all of these assets that are key to relationship blossom in later life. You know, our knees may hurt, but our emotional regulation is really, you know, on the rise. And then, as we were saying before, this idea of connecting across generations is kind of built in. And it all actually, in your reference to Africa, so, and I'll just maybe close with this, which is that this is not by accident. For many, many decades, evolutionary anthropologists were trying to understand why grandmothers existed. Why did women live beyond reproductive age? In the harsh world of the selfish gene, these were all men, you know, wondering these things. And then a woman, Kristen Hawk at the University of Utah, decided to find out, and she studied hunter-gatherer tribes all around the world, and particularly the role of grandmothers. And what she discovered was that it's grandmothers caring for young children that enables both parents to hunt and gather, and that is essentially the foundation for the long gestational period, the long period of helplessness that separates human babies from all other species, and is essentially why we became human beings. And, you know, in a nutshell, her argument is that it's older people who make us human. That if that had not happened, that is so much a part of our evolution, and it's something that we've lost over the years. And so I think the challenge for us is how do we marry the grandmother hypothesis with the modern family world? And so that small task I'll throw out to the village in Chicago.
That's right. Bravo. So thank you, Marc. There are so many fascinating stories and research findings and inspiration in his book.
Thank you.